Moho is a fairly unassuming planet. However, beyond its beige and seemingly boring exterior lies one of KSP's greatest challenges. You see guys, the unique thing about Moho is not Moho itself, but rather where it's located. The closer you get to the planet you're orbiting, the more delta V it'll cost to change your trajectory. Kerbal is no different, just on a much larger scale. And since Moho is in a very low orbit around Kerbal, it actually requires a deceptive amount of delta V to get to it. In fact, outside of artificial challenges like a Joule 5, a round trip to Moho requires the most delta V out of any mission you could currently do in KSP, which makes it the perfect destination for testing out SSTO limits. Thankfully, I've done most of the legwork in the past and designed a couple of max delta V SSTOs already, so all we have to do is simply get to orbit and get underway. Okay, a typical SSTO design is not gonna cut it this time. Based on all of my testing, the most delta V I've been able to get out of a traditional SSTO is around 10,000, which is a far cry from the roughly 15k required for a mission. However, there is still a way. Personally, whenever I think of an SSTO, I think of a craft that has no staging of any kind, and comes back to the KSC after its mission with the exact same amount of parts that it left with. However, that's technically not what an SSTO stands for. By definition, the only requirement for an SSTO is to achieve orbit in a single stage. What it does after does not matter, and will not change the fact that it's still, by definition, an SSTO. So, armed with this forbidden knowledge, there's a couple of things that we can do to increase our delta V considerably. Once we get to the vacuum of space, both the jets and their fuel tanks become little more than dead weight, so they clearly had to go first. This gave us considerable gains, and allowed us to be more excessive with the amounts of engines we used for the atmospheric stage of our flight. However, it did present unique problems that single-stage SSTOs don't typically have to deal with. Unfortunately, our Swerv, mighty as it is, simply doesn't have the required thrust to get our craft into orbit. Of course, the reasonable thing to do here would be to stage our jets as soon as they flame out, but if we did that, this would no longer be an SSTO, meaning that we have to lug the jets all the way to space before we can cut them loose. The solution I came up with was adding two vectors on the back of the craft for additional thrust during our ascent and circularization burn. According to the trip planner, our delta V was very borderline for the mission, so I've also decided to add an external drop tank to our craft to extend its range even further and allow us some wiggle room for the landing burn. However, the main reason for our somewhat excessive delta V are bugs. In theory, an optimal Moho mission requires roughly 13,000 delta V, and we have 16k. However, based on other videos I've seen, there is an extremely nasty bug hiding on Moho that is almost certainly going to make the mission even more costly than it should be. But more on that later. For now, let's get rid of our spent stages and start making our way to Moho itself. This transfer is a little unique to most other intercept burns. Typically, the only thing you care about is planet alignment. For example, a transfer to Duna is going to be maximally efficient as long as Kerbin is about 45 degrees behind Duna. However, that's not the case with Moho. Since Moho is in a pretty eccentric orbit, you also need to consider where Moho is at the time of the transfer. Ideally, you want to be intercepting Moho right as it's reaching the highest point in its orbit. Getting the timing wrong will literally double the delta V you need to intercept and circularize at Moho. And so, after waiting for a truly optimal transfer window, we started our intercept burn. Since KSP2 won't display staging properly, we need to keep an eye out on our external fuel tank's hydrogen levels, since we will be getting rid of it midway through the burn. After finishing up the rest of the burn and performing a small mid-course correction to fine-tune our encounter, the next thing on the list was a very lengthy and costly circularization burn at Moho itself. And after that, I looked around for a seemingly flat spot on the surface and put the ship on a suborbital trajectory in preparation for the landing. Moho's gravity is only slightly higher than that of the Mun, so the landing itself didn't present a big challenge. However, the two hardest parts of our mission were yet to come. The first problem was sadly on me. During our circularization burn, I ran the vectors for a bit too long. This cut into our Methalox RCS reserves considerably, which meant that by the time we land, we won't be able to use our more powerful burner RCS anymore. This is a real problem, since once we land, I plan to pitch the craft up with RCS to be able to take back off. However, I did come up with a pretty jank workaround. Since we landed on a small hill, I'd let the craft roll back for a bit before engaging the brakes. This made our craft rotate backwards, which, in theory, could provide enough of an angle to take off. After several attempts, I finally managed to pull it off, and we were on our way to Moho's orbit. However, we weren't out of the woods just yet. For some reason, in KSP2, Moho is cursed. It's basically impossible to tell what your actual trajectory will be after leaving Moho's sphere of influence, since the indicated trajectory lines are completely wrong. They honestly might as well not even be there. This meant that I basically had to open up my third eye and somehow guess a massive interplanetary burn. This took a lot of trial and error, but after many attempts, I finally got a decent enough trajectory past Moho's sphere of influence. Now, it was not perfect by any means, but I was prepared for this exact situation and still had around 3.5k of spare Delta V. Which meant that having to waste around 1.5k of Delta V on a series of correction burns that we should have never had to do was not really an issue. After getting back to Kerbin, we performed a series of aerobrakes to circularize. Our first aerobrake wasn't quite aggressive enough to capture, but since we had tons of Delta V left, I just burned the engines for a bit to make the whole process a little faster. Like always, the KSC was on the dark side of the planet once we got there, so we had to wait for Kerbin to rotate around before we could land. Thankfully, this craft is quite stable on re-entry, so the landing was relatively effortless. The only minor issue we had is that SAS basically wouldn't control the rudders anymore, so I had to operate them manually. Now, I am curious to hear what you guys think. Technically, this craft is an SSTO by definition, but word meanings can change over time, and this might not be considered a true SSTO by modern standards. Maybe we need a new word to describe a spaceplane that gets to LKO on a single stage, but then has staging events later. Maybe SSTO-ant? I don't know, guys. Do let me know what you think about it in the comments. Anyway, I do hope you guys enjoyed the video. As always, I'm Karma Von Brown, and I'll see you in the next one.